Welcome to Professor's Corner. Zach and I are discussing topics in applied ethics and public policy, and we're having a conversation about a pressing topic called New Liberalism's supposed neutrality toward personal ideals and cultures. Zach, you had raised the question about what we mean by pluralism and how it plays in and to this whole idea of neutrality. So let's pick it up there and kind of walk this through. I think the best place to begin is with the United States Constitution. You know, there's a lot of controversy right around that, and then we'll go from there upward to talk more philosophy. But even the First Amendment, we have two provisions. We have no law respecting the establishment of religion, and then we have in that same amendment the free exercise of religion, and these sort of can be at tension with one another. Mm-hmm. So we have to figure out how do we interpret this. So let me introduce a couple of ways of thinking about this idea of pluralism and kind of unpack its ambiguity. Okay. Let's call the first feature or meaning de facto pluralistic meaning. Okay? And by that I simply mean that there's no single moral or religious position has a prescriptive role in determining policy.
And that's just how things are. There are all of these religions.
And people can participate. Right. When you say, we just went through election and I voted my values, that would be de facto pluralism. Right. That's not what the New Liberal has in mind. Mm-hmm. The New Liberal has in mind that when you go through and you vote from a certain mindset. You cast away your values and you adopt a enlightened or New Liberal perspective, and that's how you vote. So they're introducing a different kind of pluralism here. And I'll call it ideal pluralism. And that means that moral and religious considerations should have no influence on policy whatsoever. Okay? So let's go a little bit further and unpack this. What's happening here is there's sort of, if I could use this, a descriptive and a prescriptive notion, right? A factual and a normative or ethical notion of pluralism. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we keep these separate in our dialogue with the New Liberal. Yeah. De facto pluralism is simply a recognition of differences of peoples and heritages, cultural heritages that we look out there, okay? There's less homogeneity with respect to shared values of a society with the de facto. That's all we're recognizing. Mm-hmm. Rather,
sort of going back to what I said about it's just how things are. Diversity exists, but it's not necessarily, it's just a fact of life.
It's heterogeneous. We look out there, there's less homogeneity, more heterogeneity with regard to the different moral principles and different interests that are expressed in variant communities, rival communities. Now that's the de facto. Then there's the prescriptive notion of pluralism. That adds with it a commendatory. We talked about prescriptive ethics in week 3. And we talked about ethical terms having two meanings, a descriptive and a prescriptive. Same thing is applied here. Pluralism becomes an evaluative term in our evaluation dictionary. Mm-hmm. And it can be used descriptively or it can be used prescriptively, and it's typically by the New Liberal to be used prescriptively. It's a commendatory attitude towards the heterogeneous arrangements of personal interests as a social ideal. You might hear this expression, ours is the pluralistic society. Mm-hmm. Right? Not only are they saying there are differences out there, but we need to embrace these differences. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to some degree, there's not a problem with that. The problem comes in is that when that plurality defaces a common morality, that's where the tension comes in, because you need a common or shared morality in order to adjudicate conflicts and for individuals to develop. Right. So this is at odds. Let me see if I can get right to the point here. We'll use Basil Mitchell because we're using him in one of our readings, and he wants to say, he discusses the concept of neutrality in terms of personal ideals or pluralism. He gives, in the paper that we're reading for this week, he gives a statement about, he'll cite a Christian philosopher and theologian that says, the liberal state should not advance to defend specific beliefs about purposes of human life. Liberal society is pluralist with respect to competing views about the good life. These conceptions are of vital interest to their adherents, but the ultimate truth of them cannot be demonstrated. You
Right.
see what he's talking about there?
That kind of sort of relates to what Bloom says in his book
Yes.
regarding so what Mitchell's saying here, that's more of it. He's offering a description of this sort of ideal.
He's
correct?
describing
He's not-
the prescriptive
Yeah, he's
notion
not
of the new
yeah,
liberalist.
okay.
Yeah, he's stepping above the debate, and he's saying, okay, I see your normative statement that you're trying. I'm going to describe it. I'm going to put it right back at you and see if you affirm it or not.
Right.
They will affirm it. Okay.
Right.
Mitchell says, good. I'm good with that.
So when he says, "But the ultimate truth of them cannot be demonstrated," is he saying that they're essentially trying to eliminate the sort of competition of ideas?
What he's saying is and this is where Mitchell disagrees, because he thinks personal ideals, at least some of them, can be assessed for their truth or falsity.
They should be justified.
Yes, they have to be justified. But the new liberal doesn't want to do that. Yet they want to say these ideals are meaningful.
Okay.
Okay, so he's giving he's reading back in the paper in a descriptive sense the prescriptive norm of the new liberal, and now he's going to take issue with the fact that the new liberal naively considers the fact that these personal ideals, they can exist because they are neither true nor false. What that says is there's no objective morality, at least on this outer realm, the realm of the ethical. There's no truth or falsity out there, not capable of determining truth or falsity. And you're absolutely right. And Bloom does the same thing when he says that the essential aspect of liberal political consensus, this is on page 45 of the book, that the political system is not supposed to espouse, promote, enforce a particular vision of the good life. That is the doctrine of neutrality within new liberalism.
Right.
Okay. So, what Mitchell wants to say, and I know it's a challenge to read Mitchell, but what he wants to say is that liberalism is not pluralism. Liberalism is not pluralism. Pluralism, which is for our term, we'll call it the new liberalism, right? But it's not the classical liberalism.
Right.
He says that Mitchell says that in liberalism we value individuals and maintain their right to develop their capacities fully and freely. Now, the new liberals are going to agree with that. But in valuing, the valuing recognizes the nature and worth of individuals as self-determining agents. That's the overlap so far so good. But he says the liberal will recognize that certain conditions are critical for growth of persons. So the role of family comes in a central way, both in its instrumental value, but also in its intrinsic value. It's a necessary means to develop the individual into a self-determining individual. It has its own value in and of itself. Also, education, at least with regard to character education, is important. Again, you're trying to form the individual.
And this sort of plays into the whole idea that no man is an island.
No man is not.
Yeah.
Now, the new liberal is going to take issue with the way that these institutions are interpreted and their role, because technically, if they're pluralists, they can't affirm that any institutions are important.
Right.
And of course, the interesting thing is, as Mitchell points out, they don't do that when they talk about property and wealth. There seems to be a pretty definitive view. But in this area, it can't be true or false, but it's meaningful nevertheless.
Sure.
And Mitchell scratches his head and says, how is it that somebody can embrace the seriousness of these sort of whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, materialism, atheism, Marxism, liberalism, or Christianity? How is it that people embrace that ideal?
At least
If they don't take it seriously.
Yeah, if they don't go to the lengths of actually trying to justify that system.
Exactly,
Of thought.
and think about its truth. So
I find that Mitchell brings it back to that all the time. Like it's important to justify the system of thought first before it can compete with other ideals. But
that's exactly what he's doing, and we have to mimic that argument in this class.
Absolutely.
So the pluralist repudiates the view of society that is the new liberal plural. Repudiates the view of society that emphasizes any substantive value of particular conceptions of the good life. Any of these views in the outer circle. Its social arrangement seeks to maximize the free play of preferences.
So in other words, they're trying to dodge what any number of these systems might have to say, and they're trying to dodge placing any of those ideals above one another. Even if they can, they won't. or at least we'll try not to.
That's exactly right. And this is where Mitchell comes in. He says, what we need to do in terms of our strategy of deconstructing neoliberalism, we need to capture this oscillation between the two meanings of descriptive or de facto and prescriptive. Because what happens is people say, well, you've got all these differences out there, and then, somehow, and we acknowledge that, and then they say, so we need to protect or preserve those differences, because not to do so would violate one's autonomy.
Right.
The new liberal says, well, of course we want a wide range of choices, but there are limits, because we're trying to create a free individual that's a self-determining agent.
Right.
And so they'll shift from the descriptive or de facto to the prescriptive. Ours is a liberal society, so we have to accept that practice. We can't judge it, and there's no true or false.
Right.
Well, I know there's differences, right? That's de facto. Are you saying you're prescribing? And then they say, well, we are because there are differences, and they go back and forth. So we have to capture the dialogue at one level or phase, de facto or prescriptive, and keep that, make the person which we're having the dialogue with, make them clarify at each moment where they are in their thinking. So having observed the realities of religious and cultural differences, in other words, we could take a look at the Project for Pluralism at Harvard University. And I just pulled there. And they start by recognizing the realities of religious and cultural differences. But then they go on to say pluralism has long been a generative strand of American ideology. Well, that's the point. That's the descriptive sentence. It's been there. It's historic.
Yeah.
It's inherited. It's received. But mere diversity or plurality alone, however, does not constitute pluralism. Why not? That's because there is lively debate over the implications of our multicultural, multi-religious society in civic, religious, and educational institutions.
Right.
So they're making the shift to get a little bit closer. They introduce the concept of the politics of difference. That is, the idea that political structure should be there to protect. And I want to say that the politics of difference in reality requires a politics of indifference, that is, indifference to truth. The person that captured this was Marianne Young in her work on where she coined the term politics of differences. And she basically says, to borrow again from the language of the Harvard Project on Pluralism, that in their description of pluralism is not relativism, but an encounter of commitments. The new paradigm of pluralism does not require us to leave our identities and our commitments behind. Pluralism is the encounter of commitments, and it means holding our dependent differences, our deepest differences, even our religious differences, not in isolation, but the differences or the relationships to one another. Now, the point here is that if I were to ask, do you think those commitments are true or false? They'd say, no, they're not. They're justified relative to the social ideal conception of their new liberalism. But well, is that true or false? They'd say no, but it's the commitment. That's what gives the meaning. So even though it's odd that they say it's not relativism, because as soon as they say it's not true or false, that's what I take to be relativism. What do you take to be relativism?
Yeah, relativism to me is just, it's whatever's true to you.
Yeah.
Whatever's true to me.
So if it's incapable of being tested to be true or false, to me that's relative. So
Right.
I find that an odd way of stating it. But you can see what they're getting at. They've moved from the descriptive, they've moved to the prescriptive. So ideal pluralism prescribes a norm. And it basically, this is taking from Mitchell, a plural society is one in which there's no general agreement about values, and in which, therefore, no particular set of values should govern legislation or social policy. Ours is the multicultural society, and the values of no single culture should predominate it. Now, what's happened in this shift, and the point that Mitchell is making, there are 3 points, and I'll conclude really, with this.
Sure.
First, it's a characteristic of the classical liberal society that there be an emphasis upon individuals and their right to develop their capacities freely and fully. It is not, like the New Liberal, a pluralist refusal to determine what the good life is. The liberal will determine what the good life is by choosing institutions. Wide-ranging.
There's a value in seeking out truth of a particular matter.
And there'll be limits.
Yeah.
And the New Liberal thinks there are no limits. But of course, Mitchell's whole point is the New Liberal has to impose limits.
Right.
So now it's a question of what criteria do we use? So it's a movement from establishing a positive case for liberty to simply a case for liberty where based on skepticism. Just nobody knows the truth, so nobody can intrude on anybody.
Right.
That's a very different notion of liberty. The second point that he's making is the ideal pluralists are reluctant to take account of the common moral considerations in devising social policy. Rather, what they focus on is they shift to remediating consequences from the breakdown of certain institutions because they don't want to make the moral judgment.
Right.
So they'll try to fix the consequences. And Mitchell will critique that. The third point that he makes is that the liberal society is safeguarded by a mindset where liberty is understood within a coherent constellation of moral values. Don't harm, fidelity of marital relationships or sexual value, value of life, some notion of justice. It forms a constellation, and in and around those values is where liberty floats. Mm-hmm. Its boundaries are the moral ideas. That's why liberty is an ideal liberty as opposed to license, because if you take those moral concepts away, that free expression becomes free play of preferences, uncapped by any sort of tether of moral ideas. And that's where the New Liberal is headed. And they think they can do this in a way without imposing any limits. But as Mitchell's pointing out in the article, they have to impose
containment,
limits.
They're eventually going to have to try
to
to
have
contain.
conflicts.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that does it for us.